When diplomacy failed, Ukraine did not respond with words. Instead, they turned the Antonivskyi Bridge into a $600 million battlefield. On January 18th, negotiations in Moscow collapsed. Within hours, the cost of that failure was measured in currency, not conversation. When the Antonivskyi Bridge was destroyed in a coordinated drone strike, Russia lost a logistics corridor valued at over $600 million. Hundreds of vehicles were trapped, thousands of troops were cut off, and an entire southern supply network collapsed overnight. What followed was not a warning. It was the literal cost of failed diplomacy. Stay with us, because what happened next was not chaos. It was pure calculation. At 8:30 p.m. in Moscow, the final round of negotiations lasted just over 10 hours. When it ended, the Russian delegation placed one demand at the center of the table. They demanded absolute protection for the Antonivskyi Bridge. This was the primary logistics crossing, linking the southern front to supply depots east of the Dnipro River. The demand was strict: no drone activity, no technical incidents, and no exceptions. Ukraine refused. At 8:52 p.m., the talks were terminated without a joint statement. Officially, they were described as inconclusive. Inside Moscow security offices, the meaning was clear. Diplomacy had failed. At 1:10 a.m., a closed Ukrainian command session began hundreds of kilometers away. No documents were filed, no digital records were created. One objective was stated clearly and only once: the Antonivskyi Bridge must not remain operational. This was not a symbolic strike or an act of retaliation. It was a calculated move to sever Russian logistics at the exact moment their convoys depended on it most. While Moscow prepared to move supplies, assuming negotiations had bought them time, Ukraine began the countdown. At 3:20 a.m., the mood inside Russian command rooms was not cautious. It was furious. The failed talks in Moscow were viewed as defiance, not diplomacy. Orders moved fast. By dawn, logistics officers were instructed to push supplies forward immediately, before Ukraine could regain the initiative. The convoy assembled in less than 6 hours. It consisted of 412 vehicles carrying over 1,500 tons of ammunition, fuel, and spare parts. This was enough to sustain 2 mechanized brigades for nearly 10 days. The Antonivskyi Bridge was selected for the crossing without debate. Russian planners classified the route as low risk. There had been no recent strikes, no drone activity, and no artillery registration in the area. According to their assessment, Ukraine lacked both the range and the political will to hit it so soon after negotiations. Radar coverage focused upward. NEBO-M systems were calibrated to scan for high-altitude threats. Pantsir S-1 units were positioned to intercept aerial targets approaching from the riverbanks. Commanders believed the primary threat was the sky. No infantry were assigned beneath the bridge, and no patrol boats monitored the waterline. Anger shaped the plan. Officers wanted fast, visible, and decisive movement. Delays were viewed as a sign of weakness. What they did not realize was that the timing of the convoy had already been predicted. The route was modeled, and its dependence on the bridge was measured down to the minute. While Russian engines roared to life, Ukraine had already moved quietly and mathematically. If you knew exactly when your enemy would cross the river, where would you wait? For 4 consecutive nights, Russian surveillance reported nothing unusual along the river. Reconnaissance drones logged normal thermal patterns. Radar archives showed no structural anomalies near the bridge. However, at 11:47 p.m., 5 days before the convoy moved, that assessment became outdated. Under the eastern span of the bridge, electromagnetic clamps engaged one after another. They secured 16 FPV drones directly into the steel framework. The installation was completed in less than 9 minutes, timed precisely between satellite passes. Once locked in place, the drones went completely inert. Each unit carried under 3 kilograms of explosives.
As you can see, the stress
this was
on
well
the central
below the
span
threshold
anchor
Russian
cables is
engineers
significant.
classified as
This
capable of
section here
damaging
requires
reinforced
immediate
concrete. If
reinforcement.
discovered, they would have been dismissed as abandoned debris. That miscalculation defined the entire operation. The drones were not programmed with GPS coordinates. Instead, Their memory contained a full structural model of the bridge, compiled from engineering blueprints. Targeting error was calculated at less than 1 centimeter. At 2:10 a.m., the final system check was completed, and all transmissions ceased. For 96 hours, traffic passed overhead. Armored vehicles generated vibration loads exceeding 2 tons of oscillation force. Yet the clamps held. By the time Russian planners approved the route, the environment they believed to be safe had already been prepared. The battlefield was no longer forming. It was already waiting. At 4:35 a.m., engines ignited across the staging area east of the river. A column stretching nearly 6 kilometers rolled toward the Antonivskyi Bridge. The convoy carried 412 vehicles packed with ammunition, fuel, and critical supplies. Its estimated logistical value exceeded $520 million. To Russian command, this movement was symbolic. No Ukrainian artillery fire followed, and no drones appeared overhead. For the first time in weeks, the route felt quiet.
This bridge is critical.
That silence was misread as hesitation. By 5:02 a.m., the lead elements reached the bridge. Pantsir S-1 units were in position, tracking nothing more than weather clutter above the river. Russian commanders failed to recognize the significance of the absence of attacks. In modern warfare, that total silence should have triggered alarms. Instead, it produced confidence. Drivers were ordered to stay tight to prevent delays, ignoring spacing regulations. As the first trucks entered the span, the convoy compressed into a dense formation. Dozens of tons of explosives were now concentrated over a single structure. By 5:18 a.m., nearly half the column was on the bridge. At that moment, the crossing was no longer a route. It was a dependency. The plan did not call for chaos. It assumed movement. But at 5:41 a.m., the convoy slowed without warning near the center span. A heavy transport truck suffered a drivetrain failure under a full load. Seconds later, a second vehicle braked hard to avoid a collision. The column compressed instantly. More than 70 vehicles, including fuel tankers and ammunition carriers, were forced to halt on the bridge. What followed was not enemy fire, it was physics. The combined weight exceeded 8,000 tons, pushing the structure into extreme stress levels. Inside Ukrainian monitoring systems, the situation changed immediately. Analytical software recalculated the engagement window. The probability of decisive structural failure jumped from 38% to 91%. No new weapons were added. Only the timing had changed. The bridge became an inevitable target. Russian commanders issued contradictory orders, causing radios to overlap with panicked instructions. What Moscow believed was a temporary delay was actually the exact condition Ukraine had prepared for. The bridge ceased to be infrastructure and became a pressure chamber. The first warning came from inside the Russian system itself. At 5:47 a.m., a Pantsir S-1 operator detected irregular electronic fluctuations beneath the bridge. The signal was weak and easily dismissed as interference. But with tension high, the operator switched to active scan mode. A radar beam flooded the underside of the bridge, lighting up dozens of reflections. At 5:48 a.m., a defensive missile was launched. The interceptor cost more than $160,000. Its target was a low-cost decoy, valued at less than $60. The explosion was harmless, but the psychological effect was immediate. The organized column became a locked mass of steel and fuel. Russian air defense had not stopped an attack. It had announced one. The protective network began interfering with itself as radar frequencies overlapped. In an effort to regain control, Russian commanders ordered expanded sensor coverage.
Look at the thermal signatures.
What they created instead was instability. The bridge was now illuminated by its own defenders. In modern warfare, when you reveal everything you are watching, you also reveal what you are not. Russian commanders turned to the A-50 airborne early warning aircraft for a clear picture. At 5:56 a.m., the A-50 began scanning the sector from 9,000 meters. From that altitude, the bridge was fully exposed. The system identified multiple thermal signatures beneath the central span. The data was transmitted to an S-400 battery positioned 80 kilometers away. At 5:58 a.m., A $3 million missile was launched to eliminate the uncertainty. Instead, it multiplied the crisis. The moment the A-50 radar saturated the area, defensive layers began competing for priority. The situation beneath the bridge became a cascading crisis. At 6:01 a.m., the S-400 interceptor locked onto a massive radar signature. It was not the target. An ALE-50 decoy had been deployed behind one of the FPV units, amplifying radar energy 100 times. The S-400 corrected course toward the brighter signal and detonated high above the river. The explosion achieved nothing but a distraction. For a brief 10-second window, no one was watching the bridge. No sensors were focused beneath the span. In modern warfare, 10 seconds is enough to decide the outcome. The real threat was no longer hiding. It was moving directly toward the bridge. At 6:02 a.m., the protective envelope around the bridge collapsed. Ukraine seized the opening. The FPV drones disengaged their clamps and surged upward. They did not scatter. They followed pre-assigned paths to load-bearing points. The drones struck targets responsible for transferring 60% of the bridge's total weight. The result was not a massive visible explosion, but an internal structural failure. Reinforced concrete fractured and steel rebar snapped. The bridge did not collapse from firepower, but from the absence of protection at the decisive moment. By sunrise, the Antonivskyi Bridge was severed, leaving a 600-meter gap. The convoy was split in two, with 200 vehicles trapped on the western side. Frontline units south of the river now had less than 60 hours of ammunition remaining. Fuel reserves dropped below operational minimums, and planned offensives were suspended. The corridor Moscow had demanded protection for was erased in a single night. There was no massive barrage or formal escalation. The cost to Ukraine was measured in thousands of dollars. The cost to Russia reached into the hundreds of millions in lost time and momentum. The most decisive outcome was the realization that the war had shifted. This operation proved that modern warfare depends on understanding vulnerability and timing. A bridge fell, but the deeper collapse happened in logistical confidence and planning assumptions. The question now is this: if war is no longer decided by strength, but by precision, what is the next critical weakness? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you found this analysis insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join the discussion below.